About 3 or 4 years ago, I was online and I was on Facebook, and I saw something talking about the Ritchie Boys. I had never heard of them before. And this is the first time I had even come up with a concept that there were Jews who fought during the Second World War, who were involved in counterintelligence and perhaps were among the most critical people in helping us to win the war. These 2,000 young German Jews actually came up with two-thirds of the credible intelligence information that ended the war faster and helped the Allies win, probably save thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives. I can tell you that the first time I even began to think about this occurred on November the 15th, 2007, the day after my dad passed away, when I was reading his obituary. And in the obit, it mentioned that he was in counterintelligence. He never spoke very much about it. And he basically left me a trail of clues, bits and pieces that he dropped over time that helped lead me to it. And I will tell you that since I began speaking about the Ritchie Boys, I've met about a dozen other children of Ritchie Boys who've all had the same story. Our fathers never talked about it by and large. The reason being that this was classified information. Their military records were expunged of this information, and they were under orders not to reveal anything about this. And it was only about 10 years ago when this information was declassified. Next slide, please. So in late 1942, the United States Army decided to create a special program to make use of the emigres' familiarity with Germany and its language. Most of these young emigres were from Germany. There were a handful from Czechoslovakia and Austria. And clearly they would be very valuable. Not only were they native German speakers, but they understood the psyche of the Nazis. And in addition to that, they also knew the countryside fairly well. They were also highly motivated and were well equipped to extract secrets from German POWs. The men were hastily naturalized, trained in interrogation and counterintelligence techniques. They were shipped off to England and they were attached to small units to combat forces that invaded Normandy and so on. These immigrant soldiers never used waterboarding, electric shock, or other enhanced techniques. They fervently believed that stooping to torture would render them no better than the Nazis. I was always brought up in my time to think that most Jews went to slaughter like lambs. And the truth of the matter is, over the last 8 or 10 years, as I've read and researched more and more, it turns out not to be the case. There were 30,000 Jews who fought with the partisans during Europe, all over Europe. There were 5,000 Jews in the Jewish Brigade who fought with the Brits through Italy and other parts of Europe. There were Jews who were involved in smuggling and other techniques to save lives and to basically fight the Germans. Furthermore, there was a revolt in almost every major concentration camp and death camp throughout Europe, as was also the case in almost all of the ghettos. So we're only learning now that Jews played a major role in fighting the Nazis during the Second World War. Now, at the time that the war was about to begin, anti-Semitism was high in the United States. When the United States entered the war, most Americans actually had an extremely low opinion of Jews. In a 1938 Roper survey, it found that 60% of the respondents had a low opinion of Jews. And the Gallup survey that was done for Fortune magazine that year found that 2/3 of Americans wanted to keep Jewish refugees from entering the United States. Next slide, please. American anti-Semitism was actually fueled by pro-Nazi organizations like the German-American Bund, that conducted a 20,000 people rally in Madison Square Garden. Next. And Charles Lindbergh's America First movement spoke of a Jewish plot to suck America into the war, and that this war was of no concern to Americans. So as a result, after Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt shied away from making Jewish persecution a central justification for the war. Anti-Semitism existed in the ranks of the American military. German immigrants, as well as American-born Jews, had to withstand taunts, discrimination, and mistrust at the hands of their comrades in arms. Next slide, please. And most guys in basic training were Southerners who hated the Jewish boys from New York, and they could make life absolutely miserable for them. According to Victor Bromberg, whose picture you see here, was another Ritchie boy in his memoir, he said that the notion that Jews were cowards who managed to get soft jobs or to stay out of the army altogether and had pushed America into the war was not uncommon among soldiers. Next one. Another Ritchie boy was Hansberger, who was a German-speaking Czech theater director. And after fleeing to the United States in 1939, he actually organized a hunger strike aboard the ship, taking his troops to England to force the authorities to allow Black and brown GI members of his theater production to eat with the rest of the crew in the onboard mess hall. Next, please. Ritchie Boys had they had many good reasons for wanting to topple the Nazis. This is a picture of my father and his family in 1927. It was actually the bar mitzvah photo of my Uncle Walter, who's seated on the far left. He was the oldest of the three boys. Standing next to him with his arms folded was my dad. Next to him is his mother. Next was my grandfather, who I'm named after. And the last one is my Uncle Otto, who was the youngest of the group. My father and his brother both had been going to college. His brother, Walter, was studying to be a doctor. My father was studying to be an international journalist. The Nazis pulled him out of college in his second year at the University of Frankfurt. And so he then worked in the largest Jewish-owned department store in Frankfurt, Germany. And he watched how the Nazis imposed the boycott of Jewish stores. They had brown shirts standing in the doorways with cameras, and anyone who walked into the store would have their picture taken. So as a result, basically non-Jews stayed away from German-owned stores. My grandmother's brother, I'm sorry, my great-grandmother's brother, Herman Berman, was beaten to death in his vineyard by the Nazis. This all was occurring while my father was still in Europe. There was terrific fear of a police state. My father was pulled off of a bus and he was dragged into Nazi headquarters and he was interrogated for 3 hours before they let him go. He told me that walking down the streets of Mayen, Germany, or Frankfurt, Germany, wherever he was at the time, if he heard a siren, he'd immediately duck into the first alleyway or building he could find. You just never knew if they were coming for you. His parents told him and his brothers that there was no future for them in Germany and he needed to leave. His parents said, look, we have a little money and we'll survive this whole thing, but there's no place for you here and you need to leave. So my Uncle Walter left around 1936, 1937 for the United States. In order to get into the United States, you had to have a sponsor who would attest to the fact that you would not be, that these Jews would not be a burden, a financial burden on the American government. So my father actually trained to be a baker, and his sponsor was a baker who owned a bakery in Hamlin, Texas, right outside of Galveston. And he signed off for my dad, and that's how he was going to come here. My father left in 1938, and he had several routes. He was determined to leave the country one way or another. He had a passport at the time and so on. And the plan A was that he was going to take a train through Belgium and then get on a ship to Great Britain and then come over to the United States. Plan B, his father was a cattle trader, a cattle dealer, and he had a lot of contacts in Belgium and the Netherlands. So his father prepared a series of letters and maps and so on to all the local farmers who he knew, so that my father, if necessary, could make his way through Belgium with the help of these farmers who would put him up and then get him to the next place. If those two plans wouldn't work, he was prepared to go to South Africa, where he had a friend there. He spoke to me about his last memories of his father and his mother. He told me he remembered his last vision of his mother was standing on the porch with her apron on, teary-eyed as he left. His father and brother Otto helped him with his suitcase to the railroad station. His father hugged him and said, "God be with you." And this was the last he saw of his father, his mother, and his younger brother Otto. He boarded the train, and he said it was a horrible, horrifying experience. He said, "You saw Nazi SS men on the train pulling Jews off of the train, and he wasn't sure whether they were going to do it to him." Finally, the train got to the Belgian border, to the town of Aachen, and he was so relieved when the Nazis left the train and Belgian policemen boarded the train. So there was such a sigh of relief for him. He finally made it to the coast, Belgium, and got on a ship to England. This was during the Munich crisis, and when he arrived in England, they weren't going to let him in. They told him that Germany and England could be at war at any time, and that how did they know he wasn't a spy? And they were going to send him back to Germany. And he argued with them for 3 hours. He said, put me in some type of a camp or whatever, to keep me here, whatever. And they said, "No, we're going to send you back." He said, "If you send me back, I'm going to jump off the ship." Finally, after arguing with them for 3 hours, they let him in. And ultimately, he made his way to Texas and to the United States. His youngest brother, Otto, was sent to a forced labor camp, and he was murdered there. When Kristallnacht struck his town in Germany, at the time there was a tremendous amount of looking at letters and so on, and you couldn't write what was really going on. So all his mother did was send a photograph of the synagogue, which was her way of telling him that it had been burned to the ground. His parents and scores of relatives were deported to various death camps, and they were never heard from again. As a matter of fact, his parents went to Majdanek, and which is a death camp, and if they even arrived there, and we're not sure because we could never find the records, they were immediately sent to the gas chambers. My father was fluent not only in German, but also Belgian French, and he had a very strong background in Latin, as well as being able to speak English. So he certainly would be very valuable to the United States. He met my mother, and they were married 9 hours, and then he was sent off to war in the UK. Another Ritchie boy who had every reason to also want to fight the Nazis was Martin Selling, and I'll just speak of him very briefly. Martin Selling was sent to Dachau right after Kristallnacht, and he stayed in Dachau for 6 months before he was released, and then he was immediately sent to America. Now, you'll find that most of the Ritchie boys came to the United States without their families. In many cases, they were single sons whose families sent them over so that they could continue the family name in some fashion. Next slide, please. So here's Camp Ritchie in Maryland. Camp Ritchie was originally a 638-acre site for Maryland's National Guard. and it was established in 1926, named after Maryland's Governor Albert C. Ritchie. In June of 1942, the United States leased Camp Ritchie from the state of Maryland for the great sum of $1 a year. And it was to be the first facility for centralized intelligence training in the history of the United States military. This never happened before. It was going to be used for instruction in conducting raids and house searches while avoiding enemy booby traps. They even built an authentic-looking German village. After being plucked from the other units, the men were hastily naturalized. They were trained in interrogation, propaganda techniques, and so on. And each session was 8 weeks long for these groups. I'm convinced, based upon what I've been able to see, that my father was among the first to be trained in Camp Ritchie. Next slide, please. Most of the Jews who went to Camp Ritchie were actually recruited by the U.S. military. My father had actually volunteered when war began. My father volunteered to serve in the U.S. military. Now, many of the soldiers in Camp Ritchie were dressed like Nazi soldiers, as you can see, and they even created fake Nazi tanks and transports, etc. Next slide. And what's interesting, you see this transport here? Just about the whole side was cardboard, made to look like a real transport. Some of the local farmers were really frightened because they thought that the Nazis had already invaded the United States. And here they were in the Maryland hills. Later on, interestingly enough, some of the Ritchie boys, while on maneuvers, would get lost and wound up on local doorsteps. But by then, the locals figured out who they were and they sent them on their way. There were actually 34 8-week classes in total at Camp Ritchie. The washout rate varied from class to class, but at times it was as high as 40%. Foreign language speakers weren't just recruited for German, but also for French, Italian, Norwegian, Spanish, Japanese, Greek, Dutch, and so on. And there were about 30 students per class. Next one, please. Some of the Nazi prisoners from Rommel's North Africa campaign were used for interrogation sessions, as you can see here. Students attended classes 7 straight days every week, and they only got the 8th day off. And evenings were also filled with hours of study and practice. Next one, please. Each class had a final exam. As you can see, by the way, there were a lot of simulations going on at Camp Ritchie. I'll tell you one of the clues I found that convinced us that my father was one of them. When we were kids, we found a picture of my father dressed up as Adolf Hitler, mustache and all, uniform and all. And we asked him at the time, you know, what are you doing dressed like this? And he said, well, we had a party in camp and I dressed up. In reality, he must have been involved in some of these simulations, especially if he were in the early stages of Camp Ritchie. But there were 34 8-week classes in total, as I had mentioned. And the final exam would test the students' immersion in details of the German military. They had to find and identify the items in the field over which hundreds of parts of uniforms and weapons and other German army items had been scattered about, and they could identify them very quickly. They also had final exams in interrogation techniques and whatever. So the Ritchie boys also were fast-tracked for American citizenship and were sworn in at Hagerstown, Maryland, 18 miles away. I often wondered how, when it took 5 years for foreigners minimally to become American citizens, how was my father able in 3 or 4 years to become a naturalized American citizen? Again, this was another clue. Next one, please. Now here's a picture of a dog tag, and you can see in the lower right-hand corner the letter C. That C stands for Catholic. If you were a Jew, you had an H on your tag standing for Hebrew. Most of the Jews at Camp Ritchie insisted that that H be replaced with a P for Protestant. It was much easier to pose as a Protestant than it was as a Catholic. Now, when the Ritchie boys were involved in interrogation, they avoided identifying themselves in case they would be captured later on, or it could endanger their families if they were still alive. As a matter of fact, I believe that when my father went to Camp Ritchie, his parents were still alive, and they were shipped out a little bit later in 1942. So among other things, he even used a pseudonym there so it wouldn't happen. Next slide, please. This is Werner Arment, a very interesting young man, 23 years old as a Ritchie boy. And he was a paratrooper who bailed out Normandy with only 15 minutes of training in parachuting. And he was captured with a whole group of others. Interestingly enough, his Camp Ritchie training saved his life so that he wouldn't tip his hand in terms of who he was. So for instance, the interrogator started with him and said, "Your first name is Werner. Are you of German descent? Perhaps you're named after your grandfather." Realizing that the interrogator gave him a plausible answer, he responded, "Yes, you're correct." Now, luckily for them, all of the German interrogators couldn't recognize a German accent speaking English. Their lives depended on it because Werner had a German accent. He stated that his grandfather and other family members immigrated to the United States in the 19th century. And many Germans, including some German Jews, came around 1848, and they were known as the 48ers. So he was then asked, "Where were you born?" And Werner picked Lynchburg, Virginia. He had never been there in his life, but many of the men from his division were from Lynchburg. And of course, with the German accent, he sure sounded like he was from Lynchburg, Virginia, as you can imagine. Well, the interrogator said, "Lynchburg?" He said, "I've been there." Werner didn't know Lynchburg from Timbuktu. And he quickly took the offensive and said, "Well, when were you there last?" And the interrogator said, "Well, in 1926, I was a very young man traveling for a German textiles firm." And Werner quickly replied, "Well, Lynchburg's changed tremendously since then." And the German seemed almost wistfully said, "Sure, I have no doubt about that." So he saved himself. He was then asked, "When and where did you parachute jump?" And Werner responded, "I can't tell you that." So his Camp Ritchie training paid off, knowing that under the Geneva Convention, he didn't have to tell them anything. He maintained his composure. He kept a friendly dialogue going. And because he had a wounded leg he was then sent to Cherbourg, where he was imprisoned with some other American POWs. He never tipped his hand that he understood German. When he was in Cherbourg, he heard a number of the Germans talking about how they like to just execute the Americans who were there. However, things changed very rapidly as the Americans were closing in on Cherbourg. And the Germans were afraid that they were going to be sent to England and they'd rather be sent to the United States. So they were treated a lot better. So once he was liberated, Werner was put right to work. And he interrogated a prisoner who said he knew of a group of Germans who wanted to surrender but were afraid of being shot by the Americans. So Werner had him pinpoint their location on the map. He brought soldiers with him, but he asked them not to walk down with him. He walked alone, and he shouted in German to these soldiers who were hiding that their war was now over and it was time for them to surrender. He assured them that they would be well treated, and immediately 2 dozen Germans came out of the brush with their hands behind their heads, led by the non-commissioned officer. So he was able to get them to surrender without fighting. From the non-commissioned officer, Werner learned the number of his regiment, where the others were hiding, and he even learned other bits of information. Werner's regimental intelligence officer told him to focus his interrogations on where the enemy units had laid mines. So while interrogating a sergeant, he found his dispatch case with a map and overlay of every mine in the area, and immediately turned it over to his superior. They knew the precise location of the buried explosives, and this would allow the disposal of units to dig up and defuse them so that the American troops didn't have to worry about walking across live minefields. On top of it, Werner made this captured soldier walk in front of them just to make sure that the map wasn't a phony. Since if he tried to go in one direction or another, they knew that he was lying and that the map was a hoax. Another one of the Ritchie Boys was Stephen Louis, and he was instrumental in interrogating General Karl Spang, who was the commander of the 266th German Infantry Division, who accidentally fell into American hands. From the papers carried from Spang, Louis found that the 266th was heading to Brest to help defend it. So as a result of this revelation, the U.S. troops did an about-face and outflanked the Germans, winning the battle and wiping out the 266th. Let's move to the next slide. If you recall, I mentioned Martin Selling earlier because he had been in Dachau. He actually crossed the channel and landed on Omaha Beach, and his team was divided in two, and they were assigned to two different regiments. And he was dispatched to the 320th Infantry Regiment. The officers of this regiment were surprised by his and his comrades' heavy accents, and they really were fearing that they had spies in their midst. And the officers debated aloud whether to disarm them and assign them to permanent KP. So as a senior non-com, Spelling spoke about explaining that he and his team were specially trained and showed their official orders assigning them to the regiment. He interrogated two German privates who described in detail what was going on behind nearby hedgerows where a German company of about 100 infantrymen were dug in. And 2 days later, he interrogated a German medic who provided the details of the German strengths and casualties. Since he had been treating the wounded, this medic knew the terrain well, and he worked with Martin Selling in drafting a map of all the German positions with special markers for fallen trees and animal carcasses and so on. As a result of this, the Americans, by using the map, were deadly accurate in destroying everything from enemy machine gun nests to their command post. And this earned Martin the Battlefield Commission. Now, Martin was kind of an interesting fellow because he almost failed interrogation at Camp Ritchie because he disagreed with the officer who was teaching it. He believed that if you wanted to get information out of the Germans, you had to be friendly and you had to kind of get it out of them nonchalantly, whereas the officer said, no, browbeat them, scare them into doing this. Well, it turned out that he was right. He would start a new interrogation, and many of the prisoners looked at him surprised because they didn't expect an American soldier to sound like them. He even resorted to a lot of choice Bavarian invectives to make his point. He used appropriate colloquialisms, and he was very effective in conveying his familiarity with German customs as well as linguistic competence. So this was important. He found that by asking name, rank, and serial number was a bad approach. It reminded the prisoner that under the Geneva Convention, he didn't have to answer anything. So instead, he began by asking how he had been captured, which got them talking, and it was more of a conversation. And he always started with easy questions first, and it was most important to develop the rapport. Whenever he sensed that he was being given misleading information, he asked a question that he already knew the answer to. The prisoner lied again, his demeanor and tone would change, leaving no doubt that he could get nasty if necessary. Usually he had to raise his voice only once, and most of the Germans would snap to attention as they had been taught to do in Hitler's army. From Dachau, he had actually learned that physical force generally didn't work. People would just say just about anything to stop their pain and suffering. So whenever he let drop that he had been to Dachau, most of the prisoners answered his question without further hesitation. Now, one obstinate prisoner asked him in an accusatory tone just where exactly Martin had learned to speak German so flawlessly. Selling immediately turned around and he said, "In Germany." And he said curtly, where I also saw how the SS interrogate prisoners while I was in Dachau. The realization that he was facing a former inmate from Nazi concentration camp was such a shock that this Nazi soldier immediately lost control of his bowels. Martin knew their fears and that they would be treated the way they treated prisoners. So they were shocked by his calm demeanor and were willing to answer questions as long as he maintained a civilized approach. Now, during the war, the Ritchie Boys warned Allied officers about the German counteroffensive at the Bulge. They had spoken to various Belgian farmers who had let them know that there were about 500,000 German troops massing towards the Bulge area, along with 600 tanks. And the American officers dismissed this, and they said, "No, we've just beaten the daylights out of the Germans. They don't have a chance, and they're not going to launch a counteroffensive." So the Americans were caught totally off guard, along with the British, because they didn't listen to the Ritchie Boys. By the way, these Ritchie Boys could travel around the countryside. They were semi-autonomous, and they could go anywhere. This was another clue to me that my father was one of them. For instance, he spoke to me once about when he was in France, how he helped deliver a baby girl who was then named after him. I couldn't help but wonder as I began to put these pieces together, how he was able to separate from his company suddenly and go into the countryside to deliver a baby. Now, there were about 3,000 American POWs who were captured by the Nazis during the Bulge campaign. And two of them were Kurt Jacobs and Murray Zappler. These were two of the Ritchie Boys. Jacobs had actually studied law in Berlin, and they had previously interrogated some Germans who then identified Jacobs and Zappler to their commander, Captain Bruns, and they said, "We were interrogated by a pair of Jews from Berlin." They were immediately separated from the other POWs, and they were asked how it was possible that they spoke such good German. So Jacobs explained that he had been a law student in Berlin. And in front of his men, Bruns said, "The Jews have no right to live in Germany." Jacobs pleaded his case like a trial lawyer, saying that he and Zappler should be treated as prisoners of war under the terms of the Geneva Convention, as captured soldiers have been treated. So they were ordered to keep their backs to the Germans who were lining up abreast of one another, and they were then cut down by a thundering volley of rifle fire. Next slide, please. And this is the grave of Murray Zappler, who was one of the two who were executed on the spot. By the way, that's the story of any of the Ritchie Boys who were captured. If they were captured and identified, they were executed on the spot. At the end of the war, this atrocity was actually reported to the Americans by a German POW who happened to be a communist. Near the end of the war, they were drafting old men and boys as young as 15 and 16, and even communists who they were claimed were the enemy. Bruns denied everything, and he blamed his commanding officer, who he believed to be dead at this point, for the execution. Next slide. Bruns was put on trial and was executed by a firing squad wearing the same uniform that he wore when Jacobs and Zappler had been murdered. Let's move to the next slide. One of the most interesting and most colorful of the Ritchie boys was a man named Guy Stern. And Stern, after the war, became a professor at a university in Michigan, and he's still alive today, as far as I know. But he described 4 successful techniques that interrogators could use to extract information from the Germans. He said one was demonstrating a superior knowledge. Second technique was bribery, offering a cigarette or candy bar as a reward. A third one was starting by talking about a non-threatening subject. And finally, the last one was genuine fear of being turned over to the Russians. Next slide. So Guy Stern and his partner, Fred Kahn, conjured up a very interesting good cop, bad cop scheme. And that is that Stern was able to secure a Russian uniform, an officer's uniform. He got medals and everything. He put on and faked a Russian accent. And he had a picture of Joseph Stalin put behind his desk. And to show how gullible the Nazis were, he actually autographed it in German and said, "To my good friend, Comrade Krukov, from Joseph Stalin," so that the Nazis could see this. And they played good cop, bad cop. Actually, Stern acted very similar to the Mad Russian on the old Eddie Cantor series, if any of you heard the radio years ago. And Kahn would interview the prisoner, and he was interrogate him. And if the prisoner was difficult or obstinate, he brought him over to Guy Stern. And Stern would go into this rage as a Russian officer and say, "It's too bad, you're going to wind up in Siberia, you'll be dead in 6 months," and so on and so forth. And most of these prisoners got so scared from this that they would spill the beans. One, for instance, told them exactly where every factory was in their town that had to be bombed. And Stern was clearly one of the most important Ritchie boys during the war. He was later on given responsibility for gathering information relating to the German railroad system. And he and other interrogators questioned 150 prisoners, and they were able to find out what needed to be done to finally destroy the German railroad system. On another occasion, he was asked to find out if the Nazis were planning on using gas warfare as the Germans had used during the First World War. And he found out that no, they were afraid that the Russians were going to use it on them. So let's move to the next slide. So this was my dad. And by the way, as you can see, he was a staff sergeant. And he was a staff sergeant when he got married. And he was married in 1942. And he had only been in the military a year. And I also asked myself, how did he get promoted to be a sergeant so fast? And you'll notice that he has AA, which is anti-aircraft, on his uniform. I don't think my father knew how to shoot an anti-aircraft gun, and I don't think he ever used one during the entire war. As I said earlier, he never spoke about much of anything except with my mother. And he carried most of the secrets to the grave with him. However, through all kinds of bits and pieces, and my brother and sister and I heard different things over the years, we would be able to piece things together. So for instance, in the back of his sock drawer, he kept an envelope. And in that envelope were approximately 100 to 150 photographs that he took at Nordhausen concentration camp. And every one of these photographs was autographed by him. He wrote different comments on each one, such as this is a sample of German culture and so on. Awful, awful pictures. I found them much earlier on because, you know, kids go through their parents' drawers when they're not around. But that was one of the clues, and I'll speak a little more about that later on. As I said, naturalization was another one. Another incredible clue was the fact that my aunt, who's still alive, my Uncle Walter's wife, and by the way, my uncle made it to 104 before he passed away. His wife, his widow, is in her 90s. And she told me how that when he was camp in the United States. For a while, she was sending him letters when he was stationed in Virginia. As a matter of fact, my father was never stationed in Virginia. So my guess is that they shipped these letters to this camp in Virginia, and then they were brought to Camp Ritchie. Another piece that kind of gave it away a little bit, and I'll show you a photograph or two later on, is my father brought back from the war a ceremonial dress dagger that belonged to the commandant of Nordhausen concentration camp. And you begin to wonder, how did a staff sergeant get the commandant's dress dagger? I'll explain that in a few minutes. He was, my father, by the way, if you have a chance, there is a film on the Ritchie Boys called The Ritchie Boys that you can get through Amazon. My suggestion would be to buy a used copy because the new ones are about $130. You can get a used one for about $30. And in the film, they spoke about Nordhausen, and that Nordhausen concentration camp was crawling with Ritchie Boys. There were a lot of them there because Nordhausen was right next door to where the Nazis manufactured the V1 and V2 rockets. And the Allies would have to give this back to the Russians when they arrived. So they wanted to get as much information as possible. Turns out my father was responsible for setting up a civilian government in Nordhausen. And he was the one who commandeered citizens from the town of Nordhausen to go into the concentration camp, to clean up the camp, to bury the bodies and so on. He was referred to as the American soldier with a large pistol on his side who spoke German as well as the natives. And there were lots of bits and pieces that went on with this. My father did tell me the story of the interrogation he conducted with the commandant. And I often wonder why he, with all these other Ritchie Boys there, including Gunther Stern, who I mentioned earlier, was also there, why he was given the responsibility. But he told the story that he interrogated this commandant for a few hours. And then he sent him home with a German policeman, and he said, "I want you to pack your bags, we're shipping you out." The policeman came back an hour later, ashen looking. He said, "I don't know how it happened, but he got a hold of a Luger pistol, killed his entire family, and then blew his own brains out." My dad did speak to me at different times about being in counterintelligence, but never talked about how he was trained. He had also fought in Normandy and at the Battle of the Bulge, where he actually had gotten frostbitten fingers and toes. Next slide. And this is where Nordhausen was. And you can see it's in Eastern Germany. And that's why they had to get what they could get out of there. My dad also was assigned to go into German towns before the Allies would take them over. And he would find out who the Nazis and the anti-Nazis were. So they knew who to arrest and who they could trust. And he was also an interrogator at the war crimes trials in Belgium, because he also spoke a Belgian French. And he told me a very interesting story, that there were some Nazis who posed as Catholic priests, and it was his job to find out who the Nazis were. So I said, "How did you find out?" He said, you could never trip up a Catholic priest on Latin grammar, but you could trip up Nazis on Latin grammar. So he was able to do it using Latin grammar. At the end of the war, my dad was offered an officer's commission to stay in Europe with the Army of Occupation, which he turned down. I will also mention a couple of other things to you. There was one particular scene at one of the camps where they were holding a memorial service and burying the victims of the concentration camp. And Werner Arment was there, who we mentioned earlier. And there were a group of German officers, and they were paraded in to stand there to watch. And they actually had the unmitigated goal to turn their backs on the graves and so on, and lit up cigarettes. Angus pulled out a pistol, and he said, I'm going to give you exactly 10 seconds to put out your cigarettes and turn around, or I'm going to blow your brains out. And he got to 8, and they stomped down their cigarettes and turned around. They gave him a dirty look, but he made them watch. There were other occasions where local townspeople approached the Ritchie Boys to identify German war criminals. One was a German doctor who had performed medical experiments. And they asked this woman, how do you know about this? And she lifted her skirt to show all the scars on her legs from what he had done to her. Another time they were able to find a concentration camp commander from Ravensbrück, which was a concentration camp for women. And these people who were identified with the help of the Ritchie Boys were arrested, put on trial. In most cases, they faced firing squads. Now, at the end of the war, many of the Ritchie Boys were given an opportunity to go back to their hometowns for a day to see if they could find their relatives or see if anybody survived. Let's go to the next slide, please. By the way, this is the ceremonial dress dagger, which I have here in my home in Florida, that belonged to the concentration camp commander in Nordhausen. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has asked me to donate it to the museum, which I intend on doing. Next slide. So my father, like these other young men, were given an opportunity to go back to their towns for one day to see if anyone had survived. A few years ago, a cousin of mine, who's an Israeli, found a letter in his parents' desk, which was written by my father on June 15th, 1945, from when he had visited his town in Germany. He never shared that letter with us. He had written it to my Uncle Walter and asked my Uncle Walter to distribute the letter, and my uncle obviously did. When I visited my Uncle Walter when he was 101, he never talked about this. None of us knew until we got the letter. But I'm going to share some excerpts of the letter with you to give you a feeling of what these young men who had fought so hard to help bring down the Third Reich found when they came back to their towns. So my father writes, I returned to Mayen yesterday, where I spent one day. The only Jews left in town, Mr. and Mrs. Ludwig Schild, and he is the most popular figure here today. When the first Americans came in, many people went to Schild, congratulating him for living through this long and terrible spell. Naturally, the Shields were very glad to see me and helped me in any way possible to get information about our dear ones and secure a few things that were left behind. Well, here's the story of our dear ones, as well as all the Jewish people in the area. The end of May 1942, all the Jews in this particular area were rounded up by order of the Gestapo, men, women, and children, with the exception of Mr. and Mrs. Schild, as Mrs. Schild was not Jewish. They were brought to the Riefsmühle, where they all stood for about a week. They were only allowed to take a small package along, and you can imagine how great the distress of these poor ones was. Many of the residents of the town went to see them off from a distance, naturally, when the day of departure came. And there were still some real and good friends left among the population, especially our neighbors, Peter Gerhardts, the Webers, and above all, the Kusers. There were more friends from out of town who also helped to provide for food when rations for Jews were cut down, the level of rations for the German population. All those friends in need had to live in constant fear to be caught by the Gestapo and also punished for their aid given to the Jews, but they kept it till the last. Well, all those unfortunates were brought to Koblenz, which is the capital of the Rhineland, turned over to the Gestapo there, and from there transported to the area of Lublin in Poland, where Majdanek death camp is. And I visited Majdanek about 10 years ago. Mrs. Shield received one card from Ralph Bonham telling that he and my father's brother Otto were working to help build railroad dams. And that card was the last they or anyone else heard from them. Usually what occurred is once they signed those cards, they were immediately executed. You can imagine how low my hopes sank. And despite the fact that I was prepared for the worst, it gave me a shock, and I still have to fight to overcome it. If any of one of you could see the town today, you would hardly recognize it anymore. And men are still working to clear everything. And do you know what the people say about the destruction? They say this is the punishment for all the crimes committed on innocent people during the past 12 years. They figured that about 800 to 1,000 died during these air raid bombings of Mayan. Men Ritchie, who was a colleague of my grandfather's, in that they were both in leading social democrats in the town, asked me if I would come back to Mayan now that all is over and that the people there would like to see us back. I answered him that none of us who left would ever have any desire again to return, as that old and unpleasant memories are too strong, and that we found a homeland much better than Germany ever was or ever will be. A land in which all people are equal and where you won't see the hatred we have found in Germany. He didn't seem to understand that now I was an American and I don't want to be a German ever again. About Aunt Clara, I couldn't find out anything. The last time she was in Mayan was when grandfather passed away. And from what people tell me, dear mother was very courageous until they left. And so was Otto, but dear father must have been downhearted and broken. All I can say is that our dear ones went through hell on earth, and should it have been dear God's will to take them away, I only hope they didn't have to suffer too much after they left home, and may they rest in peace. I realize that my report to all of you is a quite gloomy one, but you can well imagine how I myself feel right now. But all during these years, I should have been prepared for something like this. But whenever it faces you then, you find out that the hope I still had was still too much, and my regret and disappointment and heartache are great ones. Next slide. So you see, these 2,000 young Germans, German Jews, Austrian Jews, and Czech Jews made a real difference in ending the war and helping the Allied effort, haven't until this time ever received the recognition that they were entitled to. Next slide. And we certainly can take a tremendous amount of pride in what they did. Sadly, most of these young men who served never received any rewards of seeing their families again. But at least what they could say is they fought to help bring down the Nazis. And thank you. So at this point, we can go back to questions and answers.
All right, that was a wonderful presentation, just as we expected. Al, I've got who was that? Barbara, you wanted to ask a question? All right, so let's let Barbara Guilford ask a question, then I'll start reading some questions from chat.
Sure, then we'll take others if people haven't.
Right.
I'm so thrilled to be here. I've heard of you, Al. I live in New Jersey. My father was a Ritchie boy. I never really understood what that meant. He was an officer. He was a refugee from Czechoslovakia, German and Czech. And when he finally made it to the United States, he joined the Army and we went to officers candidate school. And I knew afterwards he had gone to a place, Camp Ritchie, but he never elaborated. Nevertheless, he was in counterintelligence and had a whole career until he was 50 as an intelligence officer in the United States Army. He felt very committed to giving back for having been, able to get to the United States. He survived.
My father had the same feelings, and you should be very proud of your dad.
I am.
So Al, from Leslie Floyd, It's not a question, really, but my father immigrated here in 1934 at age 9. He grew up in Bad Wildungen near Kassel. He served in the army as an interpreter for U.S. war crimes at the end of the war in Wiesbaden in a bank vault. The only thing he told me was he worked at the Mamadi massacre. He did get to go back to his hometown, but I don't think he was a Ritchie boy. That's from Leslie Floyd. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand and I'll call on you individually. Anyone? I don't see. Okay, it just says new, so just go ahead.
Yeah, this is David Romani here.
Hi, David. It's been a long time since I've seen you.
See you, exactly. You know, your story reminds me Hogan's Heroes.
All right.
Whenever I see it, I saw this Hogan's Hero. That's exactly what it was. Really was very, very exciting story. It was wonderful. I didn't know your father was a Ritchie Boys. And then
well, that makes two of us.
We met him in a synagogue, I guess, your mother and father there, right, in Bethel. And the other thing is really, I think we as a Jews, we have to think again in this world now to be sure we are united and we have some sort of cohesive plan to secure our life of Jewish life in the world.
Yes, and you, David, by the way, is from Iran. So you better be careful that they don't draft you as an Iranian to go back and fight the Iranians.
That's right. You know, when I was in Iran, you know, I found a job in Iran and I went to interview in the army. I served the army in Iran and I went there and I found a job and I interviewed with the lieutenant general, Iranian lieutenant general. He told me, you know, you're wonderful, I have a good background, you know, and go talk to the other guy next room. And I went to the next room, was a Mr. Friedman, I think Israeli Army intelligence. And he talked to me in Hebrew and he told me, that was 1977. He told me, we don't know what's going to happen in Iran for after 79. Exactly the date he told me. It's going to be revolution. So, you know, all these things happening around the world against Jews. I think we got to do some sort of Ritchie camps again. We build up Ritchie camps together and, you know, the fight against all these people.
Well, I also need to say that I think we have to have some revisionist thinking as to what happened to the Jews during the Second World War, that they didn't necessarily go as lambs to slaughter, and many, many Jews did fight. And I've got to tell you, I had an experience once. I owned a tutoring and counseling service in Fairfield County.
That's correct.
And at one time we were very large. And I went to someone's house who I had taught their son. And she said, you know, the mother said, you know, you made my son very sad when you taught about the Holocaust in school. She said, but you know, the Jews really deserved it because they didn't do anything to help themselves. Nothing to, and I was just so shocked. I was speechless from that comment. And that still stays with me to this very day. And the reality is Jews did fight. Incidentally, there were 550,000 Jews who fought in the American army during the Second World War. There were 500,000 who fought in the Soviet army against the Nazis, and in just about any other army in countries in Europe, they all fought.
And I'm very proud to say that in the army in World War II is where my parents met. They were both serving along with many, many of their relatives. Do I see any other hands? Anyone have a question? Anyone? Now, I've got a bunch of blank panels. I guess the cameras are off. So if I'm not calling on you, it's because I don't see you. Just unmute yourself and ask a question. Well, yeah,
unmute yourself if you want to. And
right. Just ask a question.
The percentage of Jews who fought in World War II was the highest of any ethnic group in America.
That is correct. That is, and as a matter of fact, with the number Al mentioned, represented roughly half the eligible Jewish adults in the United States at that time who were eligible for service. That's quite incredible when you think about it. Okay, Lauren, go. Unmute yourself.
Al, did you know that there was a Ritchie Coliseum at University of Maryland?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, and our cousins are on, they're listening too. They're from Maryland and their daughter's there. And so I just asked him, I said, Joe, is it related? And you think it is, right, Joe?
It's named for the governor,
It's named for the governor. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. We didn't put two and two together.
Yeah. Well, Ritchie, as I said, this information was not declassified until about 10 years ago. And by then, my dad had passed away. He's been gone about 14 years now. So had he been alive today, my father would have been free to say everything and we could have heard a lot. One of the things I will mention is I would teach classes on the Holocaust, and I would bring my father in and I would ask him if he could talk about at all what he saw at I'm doing well tonight, Nordhausen concentration camp. And he would say almost nothing. First of all, I think it bothered him. He was interviewed by the Spielberg Foundation. And when they asked him when he was in Nordhausen, what did he think about? And he said, all I could think about is my parents, seeing that. So it must have been very difficult on him. I will tell you that I should have realized, I mentioned earlier tonight, I should have realized later on that my father was one of them. He used the same interrogation techniques as us as teenagers to extract information out of us. It was this very warm, friendly type of conversation, and somehow he caught us with it. Or he would say something like, your teacher came into the store today, and that immediately had me say, oh, Dad, I didn't want to tell you about this test. But he always extracted the information in a non-threatening manner. I said to myself, son of a gun, and I fell for it every time.
Mm-hmm. Al, you have greetings from Barry in Alton in the Netherlands. And it says the presentation was very interesting. It's getting a little late. I see a new, go ahead one more time.
Yeah, Al, you mentioned Hagerstown, Maryland, and Ritchie. See, I know the area. I go to Ritchie Highway in Maryland. Have a customer there. That's in Glen Burnie. Is that an area? That area is Glen Burnie area, Ritchie or something?
That I don't know. All I know is that Camp Ritchie was 18 miles away.
18 miles, and then I know Hagerstown too very well.
Okay, and I'm cracking up that I've lived there my whole life and knew none of this.
Well, anytime you want to know more, come see me.
It's unbelievable.
Okay.
Great. So anyone else? Does anyone else want to unmute and ask a question or tell us? Okay, Bob Kaplan, unmute yourself, please. You have to unmute yourself, Bob. I'm unable to unmute you. You can hold down the space bar if you want. There you go. That's it.
I know that part of the theme has been the fact that it's been a massive cover-up without any recognition over the years for these people who did this for us. What you never addressed was whether it was deliberate because they were Jews, or it was deliberate because it was an operation which America really wanted to keep secret.
Well, number one, it wasn't all Jews. There were 15,000, which I neglected to mention. There were 15,000 men who were actually trained at Camp Ritchie. 2,000 were Jews, and they certainly held a special role. The others were all over Asia and Europe and so on, doing counterintelligence work. So it wasn't just the 2,000 Jews. It was also 13,000 non-Jews who were never recognized for this. It was the first time that the United States ever engaged in training for counterintelligence and interrogation techniques. That part probably caused them to not want to advertise at that point. So I don't think it was anti-Semitic.
It had nothing to do with the fact that these were Jewish people.
I don't think so, to be honest about it. And I will tell you, my father was so grateful that he was led into this country at the time. I spoke about all that he went through ahead of time, that he would do almost anything. While he was bivouacking at one point, he was run over by a 2.5-ton army truck. and he miraculously only broke 3 ribs. He refused to take compensation from the U.S. military or any disability money later on or anything. He said, the United States has done so much for me, they don't owe me anything.
Interesting.
He was the hero.
Yes, he was. And you know what? He was one of the quietest, unassuming people imaginable. He never spoke about this. He never boasted about this. If you see the movie about the Ritchie Boys, one of the interesting things is a number of these young men were not what you would call military types at all. One was an artist. If you saw Gunther Stern, for instance, he was a real character. He was an academician. He really wasn't, quote unquote, a soldier, but they rose to the occasion to do these things.
See if I recognize anyone.
Well, the time is late. I don't see any other questions or anyone unmuting. So Al, on behalf of all of our viewing audience, I want to thank you again for what we all knew was going to be an amazing presentation, and it was. And thank you all for joining us this evening. I hope you will tune into some of these other programs that are upcoming. We do have a very rich and varied assortment of programs, very much thanks to Al. So with that,
we'll see you in Cuba next week.
We'll see you in Cuba. With that, I will wish everyone a pleasant evening and stay well.